What happens when a two-star general walks into a packed briefing room and every officer in the building scrambles to their feet, except one old man in the back who just keeps reading his newspaper? And what happens when the general walks straight past her own podium, straight past her own staff, straight to that old man, and salutes him? If you've ever suspected that the greatest soldiers don't always wear their rank where you can see it, stay with me. Because once you know who that old man is, you will never look at a quiet stranger in a worn jacket the same way again. This is Raymond Earl Bouchard, age 84, retired, widowed, mostly forgotten by the world that had once needed him very badly. He wore a green canvas jacket the color of tired celery, the sort of thing you find on a metal hanger at a church rummage sale for $3, maybe $4 if someone bothers to iron it. His khaki trousers were pressed with the kind of sharp crease you could only get from someone who learned to iron in barracks where inspections were not a figure of speech. His white shirt was buttoned all the way to the throat despite the August heat, because there was a right way to wear a shirt and the weather didn't enter into it. His hair was silver and thin, combed flat with a little water, and the unconscious precision of a man who had once been inspected daily by people who wrote things down in notebooks if a hair was out of place. His hands were large and bony, knuckles knobbed with arthritis and old fractures. They held a folded newspaper, not the glossy, thin kind that comes from supermarkets, but a dense, gray thing full of ink and world events and box scores and obituaries. His reading glasses sat low on his nose. His breathing was slow and even. His face was the face of a man who had made his peace with time. It would take what it wanted, but it had to stand in line. He had driven himself to Fort Caldwell that Tuesday morning in a 2003 Bic LeSabre with 190,000 miles on it, paint oxidized on the hood, one hubcap missing, seatbelt webbing polished smooth by repetition. The air conditioner worked when it felt like it. The radio only pulled in AM reliably. He knew every rattle and vibration of that car the way he had once known every sound a worn rucksack strap could make under load. He hadn't been asked to come. He hadn't been invited. He had simply arrived, as he did sometimes, at places where the army was doing something that might get people killed later if it wasn't done right now. He signed in at the main gate as a civilian visitor, showing a driver's license that listed his weight as 15 pounds less than it actually was and an address in a low-rise apartment complex whose best days were behind it. The guard, a young specialist with a sunburned neck and a wedding ring he kept twisting, glanced at the license, handed it back, and waved him through with the same semi-bored politeness he gave to contractors and retirees coming for the PX. The guard did not see the line of tiny, almost invisible white scars on the backs of those big hands. He did not see the way the old man's eyes flicked across the access lane, the guard booth, the angle of the barrier arm, the location of the nearest concrete post, the coverage of the cameras. The look took less than a second. It was automatic, as reflexive as checking your mirrors, as unconscious as breathing. Raymond followed the base road at 28 miles per hour in a 30 zone, because he believed in not giving people a reason to stop you. Signs flashed by: motor pool, range control, health clinic, soldier support center. New brick buildings mingled with older concrete blocks built during a different war, sensible and square. Young soldiers in tan uniforms walked in groups of 3 and 4, with lanyards and coffee cups and phones. The sign for the Strategic Development Center, Building 14, was small, brown, and unassuming. The kind of sign that didn't want attention. He parked in Visitor Lot C, carefully centering the Bic between 2 faded white lines, pocketed his keys, and sat for a moment with both hands on the steering wheel. He always did that, before walking into a place like this. A small pause. A moment to decide who he was going to be in the room he was about to enter. It was not fully conscious, but it was deliberate. Once upon a time, the decision would have been about cover stories and legends, about what name he would give and what nationality and how he'd explain the calluses on his hands. Now it was simpler, civilian, retired, here to watch and, if necessary, to speak. He got out of the car, locked it, and walked toward Building 14 with the slow, steady gait of someone who had learned to ration his knees. He had a reason for being there. He always had a reason. He just didn't explain it to people who wouldn't understand it even if he used small words. The briefing was classified, though the classification level mattered more to the people who stamped things than to the people whose lives would eventually hinge on what was discussed. It was a war game review, a post-mortem on a 3-week joint exercise called Operation Ridgeline. By most measures, it had gone badly. The Army's 4th Infantry Division had just been run through a large-scale live-force simulation against a NEP adversary scenario. The exercise was supposed to test how the division handled contested logistics, degraded communications, and an enemy that actually thought. The results were being described in internal memos as, quote, a systematic failure of adaptive command decision-making under pressure. In plain language, they got their teeth kicked in. Now 40 officers were gathering to figure out why. Captain Dennis Falk was 29 years old, tall, and sharp around the edges. He had the look of a man who cared about his fitness score as much as his evaluation report, who polished his boots even though it was no longer technically required, who knew how to shape comments in staff meetings so they sounded both insightful and non-threatening to people who signed his ratings. He had been in the Army 9 years and had already done 2 deployments to places whose names were never spoken quite as loudly as the slogans about them. He was ambitious in the way of people who believed the system more or less worked if you played it well and didn't do anything stupid. He arrived at building 14-20 minutes early, which is when ambitious young officers arrive. The hallway outside the briefing room smelled faintly of coffee, carpet cleaner, and whatever air freshener the janitorial staff preferred. He signed his name on the printed roster on a folding table, accepted a plastic badge on a lanyard from Sergeant First Class Deidre Campos, who ran the admin side of the Strategic Development Center with the same calm efficiency with which air traffic controllers manage busy skies, and stepped into the room. Tiered rows, fixed seating, little desks that folded up for laptops and notebooks. The front wall was mostly screen, already glowing with the opening slide, Operation Ridgeline. AR. A projector hummed overhead. The air conditioning blew too hard and too cold on the left side of the room and not enough on the right. Falk scanned the room automatically. 30% full. Majors, lieutenant colonels. One colonel near the front with a slightly preoccupied look of someone mentally practicing his talking points. People he knew, people he wanted to know, people he needed to be seen knowing. He moved in the way people move when they are building careers. Handshakes, quick smiles, the right mixture of deference and familiarity. He noticed the old man when he went to refill his coffee at the back corner, end of the last row, sitting alone, a little to one side like he'd chosen a vantage point, not just a seat. Green canvas jacket, white shirt buttoned up, khakis with a crease. Newspaper in his hands, folded into quarters the old-fashioned way. Not a phone, not a tablet, not a briefing binder. Actual newsprint. The old man's eyes moved behind his glasses, tracking lines. He turned a page with one thick finger. His posture was the relaxed, upright slouch of someone who knows how to stay in a chair a long time without his back complaining. Falk didn't think much of it. Probably someone's father. Probably a retired lieutenant colonel from the Vietnam era who'd come in on some alumni program and wandered into the wrong room. Maybe a civilian subject matter expert from an ALIA panel. Falk topped off his coffee, filed the sight away in the part of his mind that catalogued small anomalies, and moved back to his target cluster of lieutenant colonels. Outside, the sun climbed, dragging the humid hackle of August with it. Heat shimmered on the parade field. PT had ended hours before. Now golf carts hummed, staff cars glided, and someone somewhere was cursing at a printer. At 0900, right on schedule, the atmosphere in the briefing room changed. The door opened. Major General Carol Whitmore stepped through. 40 officers moved. It wasn't a decision. It wasn't even a thought. It was something deeper, something that had been installed in them from the moment a drill sergeant first walked into a room, and they were no longer allowed to be sitting when someone that important appeared. 2 silver stars on each shoulder created a gravity well. Within that well, people stood. Chairs scraped. Conversations cut off mid-syllable. Laptops snapped shut or were hurriedly minimized. Falk was on his feet, spine straight, coffee cup forgotten in his hand. As you were, Whitmore said, striding toward the front. 40 officers Saturday. One did not. Whitmore was halfway down the center aisle when she stopped. She was in her late 50s, lean and straight-backed, with short-cropped steel-gray hair and a face that had spent too much time outdoors to ever fully belong behind a desk. There was something in the way she moved, not athletic exactly, but economical, that said she had long ago learned to carry both a pack and responsibility. Her eyes were the kind that took everything in without appearing to move. Those eyes had just found something. She turned her head slightly. The old man in the back row still sat today, still reading his paper. He hadn't flinched when 40 bodies snapped upright, hadn't even lifted his gaze. He simply finished the column he was on, turned the page, and smoothed it with a thumb. For 3 full seconds, nothing happened. A colonel near the front made a small throat-clearing noise, the sound of a man bracing for impact. Captain Falk, who knew from experience that General Whitmore's temper was not legendary but precise, waited for the temperature in the room to drop. He had heard stories about her dressing down battalion commanders in front of their staff for trying to shortcut safety protocols. He had watched her take apart a division-level presentation like it was a defective rifle. Nobody stayed seated inside a 2-stars gravitational field. Except, apparently, this old man. Whitmore looked at him. Something changed in her face. The tension in the corners of her mouth loosened. The lines at her eyes rearranged themselves. A smile started, hesitated, and then arrived fully, opening her features in a way that the officers who worked with her daily almost never saw. It was not the polite, preloaded smile of a senior officer managing a public function. It was the surprised, involuntary smile of someone who has just run into a piece of their past walking around in the present. She changed direction, not toward the podium, not toward her staff cluster on the right side, where her aide and operations officer were already half-rising, folders in hand, toward the back, toward him. 40 pairs of eyes followed her. The old man finished his paragraph. His hands stilled. He lowered the paper, folding it on his lap, and looked up over his glasses. His expression was calm. His gaze was level. He did not look impressed. He looked amused. "You could have called Ray," General Whitmore said quietly when she reached him. Ray considered that. His voice, when it came, had sand in it, the rasp of age and cigarettes long ago given up. "You could have invited me," he said. She laughed. It was a small laugh, a quick escape of sound she clearly hadn't planned for. Heads turned, because anyone who knew her knew that laugh was rare. Then, in the back row of a briefing room where rank usually flowed one way, Major General Carol Whitmore did something that every young officer in that room would remember on their last day in uniform. She came to attention. Her heels clicked together. Her back straightened until it was a line. Her chin lifted. Her right hand snapped to her brim in a salute as crisp as the day she graduated from her commissioning source. She held it. For half a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then Raymond Bouchard set his newspaper on the chair next to him with both hands, like a man placing something fragile. He took a breath, set his feet, and pushed himself up. His knees complained. His lower back signaled its displeasure. He ignored all of it. He rose until he was fully upright. Then he returned the salute. His hand moved slowly, but there was no tremor in it. The fingers found the exact angle, the precise line. It was not the salute of an old man being polite. It was the salute of a soldier who had once done this thousands of times and had never forgotten the muscle memory. The room went silent in the way rooms go silent around events they do not yet understand but sense they should not interrupt. Whitmore lowered her hand. "It's good to see you, Ray." "You too, Carol," he said. He looked her up and down. "You put on weight." There was a microscopic inhalation from several rows. She actually laughed that time. "So, I'm a 2-star general. I know what you are." He gestured to the empty seat beside him with a small motion of his hand, as though she were the guest here. "Sit down. You look tired." 40 officers watched. Captain Falk sat in the 3rd row, coffee forgotten, mouth just slightly open. His carefully calibrated ambitions went, briefly, offline. He leaned toward the officer next to him, a major named Hutchins. "Who is that?" Hutchins said, under his breath, "I have no idea." And yet the commanding general of Fort Caldwell had just crossed a room to salute him first. Sergeant First Class Deidre Campos had signed the old man in at 0742. She had taken his driver's license, typed his name, printed his badge, and pointed him down the hall with a courtesy smile. He had thanked her with a nod that was somehow both formal and gentle. Campos had been in the army long enough to know when something sat slightly outside the normal run of things. She hadn't gotten to be the admin and CEO for the Strategic Development Center by ignoring anomalies. She'd made a note of his name in her mental file cabinet. Now, with the briefing delayed 5 minutes while General Whitmore called a short recess and murmurs rolled through the room like static, Campos stepped into an alcove in the hallway and opened her laptop. She typed, Ray * Mond Earl Bouchard, U.S. Army. The first result was a brief mention in a 2009 Veterans Advocacy newsletter. Retired Staff Sergeant, it said, 31 years of service. Married to a woman named Linda, deceased 2004. No children listed. Staff Sergeant. Whitmore had called him Sir. Campos narrowed the search. She added Korea. She added Vietnam. She added Special Forces. The results changed. Her screen filled with older documents, skin pages of yellowed reports and newsletters, small-town newspaper clippings. She clicked on a digitized article from a 1969 military publication. The photo took a second to resolve. A younger man kneeling beside a map on a folding table. Jungle behind. Sweat-darkened fatigues. A battered bunai hat pushed back on his head. The face was leaner, the head darker, but the jaw was the same, and the eyes, steady, unfazed by the camera, were identical. The caption, Sergeant First Class Raymond E. Bouchard, 5th Special Forces Group, Airborne, attached to MACVSOG. Campos knew enough Army history to recognize those letters. Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, Studies and Observations Group. The unit that had run the missions that didn't officially exist. She clicked more. Bits of information assembled themselves like pieces of a mosaic, some sharp, some smudged by classification. In 14 months operating in the tri-border region of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, an area where American forces were, officially, not operating, Sergeant First Class Raymond Bouchard had run 22 deep penetration reconnaissance missions. The teams were 4 to 6 men, inserted by helicopter or occasionally on foot, tasked with locating enemy units, marking supply lines, calling in air strikes, grabbing prisoners when possible, and staying alive in places they were not supposed to be. He had never lost a man under his direct command. He had been wounded 3 times. Twice, he had carried a wounded teammate for more than 10 miles through hostile jungle to an extraction point because the helicopters could not get closer without being shot down. In 1968, during an operation whose name and details were still partially redacted 50 years later, his 6-man team had been compromised by a 400-man NVA battalion. For 4 days they had evaded, moving at night, hiding in spider holes during the day, rationing water and ammunition. On the 5th day, with 2 men too wounded to walk, Bouchard had taken the remaining 3 and conducted a series of targeted ambushes on the pursuing force, not to defeat them, which would have been impossible, but to confuse them, make them think the American element was larger, more dispersed, less crippled than it was. They had bought enough time and space to get their wounded men to a river crossing, where a small airboat from a covert program had been able to slip in under cover of darkness. All 6 came home. He had been recommended, Campos discovered, for the Distinguished Service Cross. The recommendation had been denied, on the grounds that approving it would have required acknowledging an operation in a location where the United States government had publicly stated no American combat operations were taking place. He had been given a classified commendation instead. A handshake, a pat on the shoulder. He went back to the field the following week. Campos took a breath. She leaned back in her chair and looked through the open door at the briefing room. The old man in the canvas jacket was folding his newspaper carefully, placing it under his seat. His glasses went into his breast pocket. He settled in the chair as Colonel Marcus Tell, Brigade Commander, Operation Ridgeline's senior planner, called the room back to order. The colonel started the projector. The lights dimmed. Colored maps came up. Campos glanced down at her screen again. More fragments. A training course in the 1970s where Staff Sergeant Bouchard had taught something called long-range patrolling. a name appearing in a declassified portion of a 1970 after-action report. A commendation for unparalleled adaptability in degraded communications environments. The further she went, the more a feeling grew in her chest, a faint astonishment tinged with something like shame. 31 years of service. A file full of things that most people would never see. He was sitting in a padded chair with a plastic badge that said, "Visitor." She printed what she had. Then she went back into the room. The briefing slid forward on its rails. Colonel Tell paced at the front with a clicker in his hand, walking the room through the play-by-play of failure. The screen showed the opening moves of Operation Ridgeline. They showed how the simulated enemy force had allowed the 4th Infantry Division to gain ground in predictable ways, then had slammed into their flanks not once, not twice, but repeatedly, exploiting a pattern in their movements that no one on the blue side had recognized until the exercise controllers stopped the war game and turned the lights back on. Inadequate intelligence assessment, Tell said, tapping a bullet point with a laser pointer. Failure to recognize the adversary's deception. Over-reliance on a standard maneuver template. The officers in the room watched. Some took notes dutifully. Some stared at the screen with frustration sitting low in their shoulders, replaying decisions they'd made 3 weeks earlier in simulated command posts, wishing they could take them back. 2 majors in the 4th row argued quietly, gesturing at a printed map. In the back, Raymond sat with his hands folded on his knee. He watched the slides the way a farmer watches clouds, seeing things other people didn't see. His eyes moved between the screen and the officers. Back and forth. Terrain. Faces. Maps. Reactions. After 40 minutes, Colonel Tell reached the slide labeled Core Failure. The opposing force commander, Tell said, consistently predicted our decisions before we made them. He turned to the room. I want perspectives on why. What did we miss? Hands went up. A colonel argued that the ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, package had been stacked unfairly toward the enemy. A major argued that the command decision timeline was too short. There'd be no time to digest data and make nuanced calls. Captain Falk raised his hand and suggested that the exercise scenario itself had been designed with an inherent bias toward the opposing force, which might have limited the range of Blue Force options. General Whitmore, sitting on the side now rather than at the center, gave him a look so flat he felt his cheeks heat. He wrote a line in his notebook that wasn't about doctrine. Don't blame the scenario. The discussion circled around. It touched many things, staff processes, intelligence fusion, communications, but somehow never quite pierced the center of the problem. Whitmore sat quiet. She had pulled herself physically away from the front, taking a side seat to blunt the chilling effect of her rank, but whenever someone's argument strayed toward excuse, her eyebrows made the smallest correction. In the back row, Raymond's right hand ascended a few inches, then paused. He raised it the way you raise your hand in a town hall when you've listened for a while. Let people talk themselves through what they already know, and decide the moment has come to say the thing that hasn't been said. Colonel Tell saw the movement. He hesitated. The man on the roster was listed as visitor, civilian, but then he saw the smallest nod from General Whitmore. It wasn't dramatic, just a tiny tilt of her chin, as if someone had just fired a flare in a night sky only she could see. Yes, sir, Tell said. Please. All heads turned. Raymond stood slowly. It took him an extra second to get his weight under him. No one missed that. But when he was upright, he had a stability that most of the younger men in the room would have envied. He did not walk to the front. He did not take the microphone. He just spoke. Your opposing force commander, he said, was reading your logistics signals. Silence. He let the sentence hang for a moment, watching the faces. Every time your units resupplied, he went on, they followed the same directional pattern relative to the main supply route. Didn't matter what the tactical picture looked like. The resupply pattern was fixed because your doctrine is fixed. You telegraphed your next move 12 hours before you made it. He nodded toward the map on the screen. He wasn't anticipating your tactics. He was anticipating your logistics. He let that sink in. In 1968, he said, up near the Laotian Panhandle, I had a similar problem. Different terrain. Same mistake. The room leaned in as one. We'd been running reckon against an NVA regiment that liked to play shell games with its supply lines. We'd insate, track them for 3 or 4 days, call in some air, pull out. Did that enough times that someone on their side started paying attention to our habits. What we didn't realize at first was that they had a signals guy listening to our traffic. Not the content, just the pattern. Every time we requested extraction, there was a window, 6 hours between the first request and when we actually moved to the pickup point. That was protocol. Standard. The system was built that way to let command get aircraft, check weather, coordinate with other assets. Their signals guy figured that out. He scratched his jaw absently with one knuckle, a small habit he'd had for 50 years. After a while, every time we keyed that freck with an extraction request, they'd start repositioning. They knew we'd be pulling out in 6 hours. All they had to do was estimate our current position, project a probable exfil, and move to cut us off. He shifted his weight slightly, eyes on the front row. We fixed it by making 4 fake extraction requests in a row over 3 days. Every time, we called it in on schedule. Every time, we did not move. We stayed put, miserable and bored and hungry, listening to them stomp around looking for us in all the wrong places. Several officers smiled, involuntarily. By the time we made the real request, they decided the signal was noise. We got out clean. He glanced around. Your doctrine is the problem, not your execution. When the enemy understands your doctrine as well as you do, your doctrine becomes a liability. You all keep talking about improving your adherence to the system. I'm telling you, sometimes the system is exactly what kills you. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of mental movement. Captain Falk's pen was flying. Up front, Colonel Tell turned to look at the slide currently on the screen. A flowchart labeled Logistics Flows, Standard Template. It now looked, to him, like an exhibit for the prosecution. Whitmore watched her officers' faces the way she had once watched aerial reconnaissance photos, looking not for what was obvious, but for the faint shadows of what would matter later. A colonel raised his hand. Sir, may I ask, what was your unit? MACVSOG, Raymond said. 5th Special Forces Group. B-52 Project. The air in the room changed. Several officers glanced sideways, gauging who around them understood what that meant. The younger ones had only seen the acronym in books or war college electives. The older ones had reading habits that occasionally wandered into histories of things the Army didn't put on recruiting posters. Project B-52, sometimes called Project Omega, had been the long-range reconnaissance element of SOG. 4-man teams going where the maps had no grid lines, operating in areas their own government would later swear had never seen an American boot print. How many missions? Someone asked from the front. Classified number, Raymond said. Then, after a second, more than 20. Fewer than 30. All of them in terrain your maps call 3 different countries. A major near the front, younger than some of the medals on Raymond's chest would have been if he'd ever worn them, spoke up. So, if you don't mind my asking, why haven't I heard about you? Raymond's mouth quirked faintly. That was the point, he said, and sat down. The briefing ran its course after that, but the center of gravity in the room had shifted. Officers still asked questions, but several of them now glanced at Raymond as they spoke, checking their comments against the quiet barometer in the back row. When someone suggested that the resupply pattern could be adjusted with a minor tweak to the standard operating procedure, Raymond made the tiniest shrug, as if to say, "You're still thinking inside the wrong box." By the time Colonel Terrell called an end to the official portion and gave the standard admonitions about applying lessons learned across commands, the energy in the room had changed from defensive to thoughtful. People stood. They did not rush the door. They looked back. When the last slide had gone dark and the projector lamp had cooled with a soft tick, Whitmore stepped to the front again. "Before we break," she said, "I want a minute." The room settled. Chairs squeaked as officers sat back down. "The man in the back row is Raymond Earl Bouchard," she said. "He spent 31 years in the United States Army, the last 14 of them running deep penetration reconnaissance missions in denied territory in Southeast Asia." She did not read this from notes. She had read his file long ago, when much of it was still linked out. Since then she'd absorbed every declassified scrap as it emerged, fitting them together with the living human being she had known since the early 90s. He was recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross at least twice, she went on. He received neither, because recognizing what he did would have required acknowledging operations this country had chosen, at the time, to deny. She let that hang. He took his handshake, his classified commendations, and his scars, and went home. No parade. No magazine covers. He went to work in a hardware store for a while. He coached a youth baseball team. He took care of his wife when she got sick. He buried her when the time came. He came to funerals for men whose names will never appear in unit histories. Her voice was calm, not dramatic, but there was something in it, thin as wire and just as strong. He drove here today, alone, unasked, uninvited, because he read an unclassified summary of Operation Ridgeline, recognized a failure pattern that got men killed 50 years ago, and decided he'd better say something before it got men killed again. Officers shifted in their seats. He sat in the back of this room and listened to 40 officers with combat patches, advanced degrees, and decorations, talk around the problem for 2 hours. She nodded toward him. Then he raised his hand and said in 90 seconds what none of you had found yet. She looked slowly around the room. I want you to sit with that. Not as a criticism of your intelligence or your dedication. You're good at what you do. You work hard. You care. I know that. I see it every day. I want you to sit with it as a reminder of something else. Where knowledge lives. Who carries it? What it costs to get it. She tapped the side of her own head. Doctrine is written by people. People with experiences. People with stories. If you forget that, doctrine becomes scripture, and scripture doesn't change when the enemy does. Men like Mr. Bouchard paid for their understanding in a currency the rest of us should never cheapen or ignore. Silence. In the second row, a first lieutenant raised her hand. Whitmore saw eagerness and uncertainty on the young woman's face, like two competing radio signals. Yes, Lieutenant Hargrove, she said. Hargrove cleared her throat. I don't have the right words for this, but I wanted to ask if Mr. Bouchard consults, advises. I don't know the proper term. She glanced back, eyes meeting Raymond's. I'd like to learn from him. I just don't know the way to ask that without sounding, she faltered. Without sounding like I'm trying to acquire something instead of understand it. Some of the older officers looked at her with a faint softening in their eyes. There was something guileless in the question, something clean. Whitmore turned toward the back. Raymond was already watching the lieutenant. There was an old, familiar feeling in his chest, recognition. Not of talent, exactly. Of hunger. He had seen it in the faces of young wrecking men who showed up at FOBs wanting to go where the maps ended. Come find me after, he said. His voice carried without effort. I'll give you my number. He said it without ceremony, as if offering someone a seat on a bus. Yes, sir, Hargrove said. There was a catch in it, small but audible. Some debts don't expire, Whitmore thought. She dismissed the room. People filtered out in clumps. The colonels and majors clustered around Tell for a few last comments. A cluster of captains began arguing quietly about whether the logistics changes implied by Raymond's observation could be implemented division-wide without breaking everything else. Sergeant Campos moved quietly among them, collecting stray handouts, closing laptop lids. She slipped a printed sheet into Colonel Tell's hand as he passed her. Sir, she murmured. He glanced down at it. His eyes skimmed once, then came back and read more slowly. The lines about 22 missions. The denial of the Distinguished Service Cross. The quote from a Special Forces colonel named Whitaker. Bouchard's capacity to operate effectively in denied, degraded, and isolated conditions remains without parallel in my experience. Tell had been in the Army long enough to know when the words without parallel were not being used lightly. He looked up. Through the thinning crowd, he could see General Whitmore sitting next to Raymond in the back row, talking quietly. A young captain, Falk, hovered nearby, clearly waiting for a chance to join the conversation. Tell folded the paper once and slid it into his folder. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a small, stubborn pride, the kind every commander had in his own understanding of war, took a step back and made room for something else, humility. Captain Falk approached when the flow of people between him and the back row thinned enough. He did not move with the knee-bent eagerness he'd had that morning. Something had shifted in him, too. He felt, acutely, how little he knew. He waited beside the row until Whitmore glanced up and gave him a nod. "So," Falk said, addressing Raymond. "I'm Captain Falk. I just wanted to say that was the clearest explanation of what went wrong that I've heard in 3 weeks." Raymond looked at him over his glasses. Falk hesitated, groping for words. "We've been buried in slides. The same facts you just spoke to are in a dozen of them. But it didn't click. Not the way it did when you told that story." Raymond made a small sound that might have been acknowledgement. "If you don't mind my asking," Falk said, "what made the difference between your slides and my story?" Raymond asked. "Yes, sir. I wasn't describing the doctrine," Raymond said. "I was describing what happened when the doctrine failed and what we had to do instead." His eyes held Falk's, steady. "There's a difference between reading about fire and being burned." Falk nodded slowly. He had been near enough to real fire a few times to know the truth of that. "Can I ask another question, sir?" he said. "You can ask as many as you like," Raymond said. "Whether I answer is another matter." Falk smiled despite himself. "How did you know to come today? To this briefing, specifically?" "I sit on a Veterans Review board," Raymond said. "They send us unclassified summaries of major exercises sometimes. Public relations, mainly, makes people feel included." His mouth twisted slightly. It wasn't quite a smile. "I read yours. I recognize the pattern. We lost men in 66 and 69 to variations of the same mistake. Enemy reading our habits before we read theirs." He picked up his folded newspaper and smoothed a corner. "Pattern recognition is the only real advantage age gives you, Captain. Well, that and knowing when to stop talking. Is that why you didn't stand up when the general walked in?" Falk asked before he could second-guess the question. "You were thinking about the pattern." Raymond looked at him. The lines at the corners of his eyes held tiredness and mirth in equal measure. "Son," he said, "I have stood for things that deserved standing. I have stood for flag-draped caskets and medevac litters and men who walked out of places no one thought they'd walk out of. Reflex is a precious thing. You don't give it away every time some brass walks through a door." He glanced at Whitmore. "She knows what I think of her. She doesn't need me to pop up and down like a jack-in-the-box to prove it." Whitmore huffed softly. "He's always been like this," she told Falk. "I met him in 1993 when I was a captain at Bragg. He refused to stand for me even then." "I stood for you when it mattered," Raymond said. "Yes, sir," she said quietly. Falk, who had never in his life thought about saluting as a limited resource, felt something rearrange in him. After the room had mostly emptied, after the murmur of voices had receded down the hallway, Raymond and Whitmore remained for a while in companionable quiet. The briefing room, without people, felt larger. The rows of seats were suddenly just furniture. The big screen at the front, still glowing faintly, showed the last map they'd projected. Stylized contees, blue arrows, red markers. Raymond looked at it the way some people look at old photographs of themselves. Not with nostalgia, exactly. With recognition of the weight they'd once carried. "Tommy would have liked that lieutenant," he said. Whitmore turned her head. "Who?" "Point man of mine," Raymond said. "Back in 68. Tommy Reyes. 22. Albuquerque kid. Could read a jungle better than most people read books." "What happened to him?" she asked, even though she suspected she knew the shape of the answer. "Protocol happened," Raymond said, "and an enemy who figured out the pattern before we did." He took off his glasses, rubbed the bridge of his nose, put them back on. "We were supposed to sit tight for extraction. He wanted to move early. I overruled him, because the book said sit tight." He shook his head once. "We brought him home in a bag." Silence lay between them for a moment. Not heavy, but undeniable. "That's why you come to these," Whitmore said quietly. "These after-actions. These war games." Raymond's eyes stayed on the map. "I come," he said, "because Tommy Reyes deserves officers who aren't slaves to doctrine. Because if the 22-year-olds in these chairs walk into a situation they think the book covers, and it doesn't, I want some voice in their head other than a bullet point. He picked up his newspaper, though he didn't open it. I don't do it for recognition, he added almost as an afterthought. They tried to give me some of that. Medals they forgot to award. Pieces of ribbon in boxes, 50 years late. I told them to save the postage. You accepted the Silver Star, Whitmore said. I accepted that because my platoon sergeant would have haunted me if I didn't. He shrugged. The rest. The war happened. My opinion of it doesn't change what it was. They sat for a while. Eventually, Whitmore said, You drove yourself here. I still have a license, he said. I know you do, she said. I'm still having someone drive you home. Carol. I outtrank you now, she said smoothly. Don't make me prove it in front of the privates. He snorted, which from him was roughly equivalent to a laugh. Fine, he said, but I want my car back tomorrow. I don't trust your motor pool with it. I'll have someone bring it, she said. Make sure they know how to drive a car with character, he said. It pulls right when you brake. I'll tell them to treat it like a general, she said, gently and with a healthy fear of unexpected lurches. Back in her office an hour later, Whitmore perched on the edge of her desk rather than sitting behind it. The command-plated chair behind the desk sometimes made her feel like she was in a turret. Campos stood in front of her, holding the printout she'd given Terrell, now copied. You dug this up fast, Whitmore said, flipping through the pages. Good work, Sergeant. Yes, Campos said. It wasn't that hard, once I added the right search terms. People have been writing about that unit more lately, as things get declassified. Whitmore paused on the highlighted quote. His instinct for asymmetric thinking is not taught. It appears to be constitutional. Do you know why I asked you to bring this? She said. To Campos hesitated. To have it on file. For the general staff. Whitmore shook her head. So you could see it, she said. So you could know exactly who you signed in this morning with a sticker badge and a ballpoint. Campos swallowed. Yes. We are very good, Whitmore said, at tracking certain kinds of excellence. Test scores, fitness, degrees, ratings. We are less good at capturing the kind that doesn't fit in boxes. She tapped the paper. When that kind walks through your checkpoint, I want you to recognize it. Yes, Campos said. And when she left the office a few minutes later, she walked past the visitor sign-in table and looked at it with different eyes. Lieutenant Hargrove found Raymond in the lobby, sitting in a chair near the vending machines while a young specialist in a polo shirt stood near the door holding a set of car keys, his assigned driver. The lieutenant halted, suddenly unsure how to open her mouth. Raymond looked up. Lieutenant, he said, as if they'd already been speaking. You came. Yes, sir, she said. I was serious about wanting to learn from you. Good, he said. If you'd said it and then walked away, I would have written you off as a tourist. She blinked. A tourist, sir. People who like the idea of special knowledge more than the work of earning it. He nodded toward the chairs across from him. Sit. She's Saturday. Do you have a notebook? He asked. She held up her phone instinctively. He looked at it as if she'd just produced a spoon at a gunfight. A notebook, he repeated. Paper. Spiral. Lines. Not with me, she said. I can grab one. Next time, bring a notebook, he said. Writing by hand makes you think different. Slower. That's good. Thinking slow now saves lives when you have to think fast later. Yes, sir, she said. For now? Then, he said, I'll tell you one thing and you can remember it the hard way. Yes, sir. Never, he said, trust a pattern you didn't know you were making. She frowned. Sir, look at your training, your habits, your routines, he said. They all create patterns. If you're not conscious of them, someone else eventually will be. And that someone will not be on your side. He stood up carefully, hand on the arm of the chair, joints protesting. That's all you get for free, he said. If you still want more after you think about that a while, call me. He scribbled a number on the back of her visitor badge with a pen he produced from somewhere inside his jacket. The handwriting was surprisingly neat. Don't text, he said, handing it back. Call. If it's important enough to ask, It's important enough to use your voice. Yes, sir, she said, tucking the badge into her notebook, the one she would start carrying tomorrow. Lieutenant Hargrove called him the next morning. He answered on the second ring. Good, he said. You didn't overthink it. Yes, sir, she said. You said Thursday. That was for coffee, he said. This is different. You're learning already. Take opportunities sooner than you said you would when they present themselves. They set a time anyway. On Thursday, she met him at a coffee shop near his apartment, the kind of place in a strip mall that advertised Wi-Fi on a chalkboard and sold muffins as large as small countries. He was there 15 minutes early, sitting with his back to the wall, facing the door. His coffee sat in front of him, black. The newspaper lay folded at his elbow. She walked in with a legal pad and 2 pens. He nodded once. That's better, he said, seeing the pad. They talked for 4 hours. He did not talk about glory. He did not talk about heroics. He talked about small, specific things. Always know where the nearest water is, he said. Not in a general sense. Precisely. Rivers, tanks, pipes. Your body and your unit move at the speed of water. He made her draw 2 columns on a page. On the left, he said, write doctrine. On the right, reality. Now pick a task from your field manual and write how the book says to do it in the left column. In the right, write how you think it will actually go the first time you try it in a storm, at night, with half your people sick and your radios acting up. She started writing. He corrected her gently once or twice. No, you're still describing doctrine there, he said, tapping his finger. Reality is messier. If you can't see the mess in your head yet, you need to study more stories. He gave her reading lists. History books she'd never heard of. Memoirs written by people whose names had never been turned into movie credits. Papers on logistics. A manual on old long-range reconnaissance patrol techniques from a world before hers. You're going to operate in a world full of toys, he said. Drones. Satellites. Digital mission command. That's fine. Use every toy they give you. But remember that somewhere under all of it, people still walk and bleed and get tired at the same rate they always have. When she finally closed the legal pad, her hand cramped and her brain humming, it was late afternoon. Sun angled across the parking lot outside. The coffee in his cup had gone cold. Why are you doing this? She asked as they walked to the door. For me. I mean, for us. For Tommy, he said. She waited. And because someone did it for me, he added. Captain Mills, 1964, took a young sergeant who thought being brave and in shape was enough and spent months pounding humility and watchfulness into his head. He looked at her. Debt doesn't always run one way. I'll try to be worth it, sir, she said. He shook his head. It's not about you being worth me, he said. It's about you being worth the people you'll lead. She thought about that sentence long after she drove away. Over the next 6 months, she called 19 times. Sometimes they talked for 15 minutes. Sometimes for 2 hours. Sometimes he did most of the talking. Sometimes he listened while she described an exercise or training failure or an idea she had and then asked 1 or 2 questions that cut to the bone of what she hadn't considered. Once she called him from a field exercise, sitting in the cab of a truck while rain hammered the roof so hard she had to shout. Her unit's carefully crafted plan had just collapsed under the weight of mud, a late convoy, and a misread map. We did everything by the book, she said, frustrated, and it still broke. Good, he said. Now write in your notebook why it broke. The book didn't get you out of this. The book got you into it. Your job isn't to memorize the book. It's to know when to close it and look around. So, are you saying doctrine is useless? She asked. No, he said. I'm saying doctrine is a starting point, not a cage. You ever seen a carpenter who only knows how to use a hammer the way the manual says? You'd fire him. It's the same with officers. Learn the book. Then learn where the book ends and your brain has to begin. She filled notebooks. He never once told her what rank he had retired at. She never asked. While that slow transfer of knowledge moved along a phone line between a small apartment in Virginia and various training areas, life went on at Fort Caldwell. Operation Ridgeline became a stack of follow-up tasks and policy recommendations. Logistics templates were revised. Staff training modules were adjusted. PowerPoints were updated. In one corner of one of those updated slides was a small bullet point. Increase irregularity of resupply movement patterns to avoid signal exploitation. Underneath it, in the notes field where only the briefer would see, Colonel Tell typed, "Thanks, Ray." Whitmore, for her part, pushed harder on her officers during planning sessions whenever she smelled too much comfort. "What are you assuming the enemy won't do?" she asked in a division rehearsal of concept drill, finger-tapping the edge of the map. "Make a list. Then make a plan for what you'll do when they do it anyway." She wrote 3 words at the top of a personal notebook and underlined them every time she opened it. "Don't be predictable." 6 months after that first briefing, Lieutenant Hargrove's unit deployed. Different continent, different war, different political slogans wrapped around the same old human behaviors. The terrain was arid instead of jungle, but the logic of the place was the same. People with their own reasons for fighting, supply lines that mattered, information that was never complete. 3 months into the deployment, her small team found itself facing a situation that scraped right up against the edge of their training. The opposing force, a mix of local fighters and foreign advisors, had started to read them. Patrol routes that had once produced nothing began to attract ambush fire. Resupply convoys found crude but effective mines in predictable choke points. Requests for aerial support were being spoofed by someone on the other side with enough technical savvy to mimic their formats. They had a pattern. The enemy had mapped it. Sitting in a makeshift command post, plywood walls, radio chatter, the constant staleness of recycled air, Hargrove spread a map out on the table and stared at it until the lines blurred. Her platoon sergeant talked quietly with a squad leader in the corner. Her soldiers cleaned weapons, swapped stories, tried not to glance too often at the casualty evacuation routes. She took a breath and heard, very clearly, a rasping voice from a coffee shop months and miles away. "We made 4 fake extraction requests in a row." She pulled a fresh sheet of paper from her notebook. In one column, she wrote, "What they expect us to do." In the other, "What we can afford to do." She made 4 movements in 48 hours. On paper, they looked like patrols, departure times logged, radio checks conducted, route names announced. On the ground, there were half movements, short pushes, patrols that went out just far enough to register on the enemy's listening posts and then stopped, or turned back, or sat tight in defilade instead of pushing through the predictable choke points. Resupply requests were sent up the chain and then deliberately canceled late, blamed on maintenance issues and availability conflicts that would make perfect sense to anyone reading after the fact. 3 times, the enemy reacted exactly as she hoped they would. Ambushes sprung on empty roads. Mortar rounds landed on coordinates where no one was. Field cameras captured figures moving into positions that would have been perfect yesterday. By the 4th decoy, the enemy's reaction time had slowed. On the 5th movement, when her unit actually shifted position, there was no ambush. They moved in an irregular pattern, resupplying from an off-axis route that wasn't on any of the standard diagrams. It was risky. It was exhausting. It was not what the doctrine would have told her to do. It worked. Her team came home. She sat on an ammo crate behind the command post that night and wrote a letter by hand. "Dear Ray, you told me to call if I ever felt the doctrine becoming a cage. Today we had to pick the lock." She described the pattern, the decoys, the absence of enemy fire where there would once have been plenty. "I heard you in my head," she wrote. "I hope you don't mind." She mailed the letter, because some words shouldn't travel over fragile networks. 3 weeks later, back at his apartment in Virginia, Raymond opened an envelope with her handwriting on it. He read it in the light of his kitchen window, morning sun falling across the table, a coffee cup at his elbow. When he finished, he sat for a while. Then he took out a pen and paper. "Dear Hargrove," he wrote, "you found the right question. Most people never do. The rest is just practice." He went on for 3 pages, telling her about another mission in 1969, about the way they'd had to pretend to be lost to get the enemy to reveal where they thought the American team was, about how much you could learn from what your adversary assumed. He did not lecture. He did not praise. He treated her like a peer who had done something worth talking about. At the bottom, he signed, "Ray, no rank, no unit, No extra words. He was 85 by then. The Bic had finally given up, transmission dying in a grocery store parking lot with a sound like a sigh. He had sold it for parts and learned the bus schedules. He walked more slowly. The arthritis in his hands made opening jars an exercise in strategy. But his mind was still sharp, and the inclination to share what he knew had, if anything, intensified, as if some inner clock had started ticking more loudly and he felt the need to offload what he could before it ran out. Once a month, he went to Fort Caldwell in a car driven by a specialist or a sergeant half his age. He wore the same canvas jacket. He signed in with the same slow, careful handwriting. He sat in the back of different rooms while different briefings unfolded, listening until someone finally asked the question that mattered, when necessary, asking it himself. Sometimes, he said nothing at all. Sometimes, the officers got there on their own, and he walked out with a small, private satisfaction, the quiet joy of seeing people he would never meet in the field do something the smart way instead of the easy way. Sometimes, after a particularly stubborn briefing where no one seemed willing to consider that the enemy could be both nasty and clever, he would go home, sit in his chair, and close his eyes, seeing instead the faces of men who had died because someone once made that same mistake. He did not cry. He had done that already, in other decades. He just resolved to go back again next time. On one of those visits, as he eased himself into his usual back row seat, Captain Falk, now promoted to Major, slid into the seat beside him. "Sir," Falk said. "Major," Raymond replied. "I wanted to tell you," Falk said, "we ran a division-level exercise last month. We changed our logistics templates. We randomized our resupply routes within constraints. It worked. The opposing force never managed to get ahead of us." Raymond nodded once. "Good," he said. "We got some pushback," Falk added. "Some people didn't like the departure from Standard." "People rarely do," Raymond said. "That's why it's called Standard." Falk smiled. "I quoted you," he admitted. "I said doctrine is a starting point, not a cage. Did you credit me?" Raymond asked dryly. "Yes, sir," Falk said. "I said, an old man whom General Whitmore saluted once told me." Raymond made that small, almost smile again. "That's enough," he said. "The greatest soldiers don't always carry their history where you can see it. Sometimes they carry it in a canvas jacket and a folded newspaper, in a pair of hands that shake a little when they reach for a coffee cup but not at all when they return a salute. Sometimes the reason the old man in the back doesn't stand when everyone else does is not disrespect. Sometimes it's because he has already spent a lifetime standing, in rivers up to his chest at night holding a wounded man above the water, on hilltops under mortar calling and corrections, in hospital corridors waiting for surgeons to say whether someone who trusted him had made it, and whatever reflex you see in a briefing room is, to him, the least important kind. The rank that once dictated where he sat in a room is gone from his shoulders now. The passwords and call signs he used to whisper into radios are obsolete. The missions he ran exist only in declassified fragments and the fading memories of the few who survived them. But the knowledge is still there. The pattern recognition, the instinct for asymmetry, the reflex to ask, what are we assuming, and what happens if we're wrong? That doesn't retire. It sits in the back row, reading a newspaper, waiting for the moment when the conversation in the room circles closer and closer to something vital and then stalls 1 inch short. Then, if someone is paying attention, a hand goes up, and in 90 seconds, an old man in a $3 jacket gives a room full of decorated officers the most valuable thing in it. Not a story about himself, not a lecture about how things were harder back in his day. Just a way of seeing. A reminder that doctrine is only as good as the minds that are willing to question it. A quiet insistence that predictability is a luxury you cannot afford in a world where someone on the other side is always watching, always listening, always ready to exploit the patterns you don't know you have. If this story stays with you, let it change the way you see the quiet ones. The retired man in line at the grocery store who checks the exits without seeming to. The neighbor who shuffles to his mailbox in a faded field jacket, who never volunteers what he did before he started giving out candy on Halloween. The visitor in the back row of the next meeting, the one nobody introduced properly, who watches more than he talks. They may not wear their history in a row of ribbons. They may not stand when you expect them to. But some of them carry a louder history than any microphone, written in the thin white scars on their hands and the way they look at maps. And if you are lucky enough to hear one of them clear his throat, raise a hand and start a sentence with, "In 1968, stop talking. Listen." Because the truth that arrives in those next 90 seconds might just be the one thing in the room that keeps someone, someday, from dying in the same old way.